This new Zenless Zone Zero chapter left me with a strange feeling. At first I thought I knew what was bothering me. New region, new story direction, big important chapter. But somehow, the opening did not hit as hard as I expected, and for a while I thought that was the problem. The chapter kept going, and the more I played, the more that answer started feeling too easy. There was something else happening here, something awkward on the surface, but genuinely exciting underneath it. A few scenes frustrated me more than they probably should have. A few moments made me stop and think, wait, why did they present it like that? But then near the end, the story reached a point where I suddenly understood what this chapter was really trying to build toward. And honestly, that part might be one of the most interesting things Zenless Zone Zero has done with their protagonists so far. So today I want to talk about why this update felt a little strange at first, why that first impression did not end up being the full story, and why the thing that stayed with me most was not what I expected at all. The first thing that felt a little off was the introduction to the new region. Not terrible, not broken. Honestly, as far as region introductions go, in games like this, it was mostly fine. Maybe a little too quick, maybe a little too eager to move into exposition. But I don't think that is the real problem. The bigger thing I kept noticing throughout this episode was something else. The cinematic direction. And this is where it gets interesting, because I actually like what ZZZ is trying to do here. The game has always had a very strong visual identity. The comic panel scenes are stylish. The visual novel style scenes work because they know what they are. They're not pretending to be full animation. They use framing, expressions, dialogue, and timing to create a specific flavor. But lately, ZZZ has been using this third style more often. The one that feels like it's trying to be closer to an anime scene. This is exactly the kind of thing a game can do that a normal written story cannot. Cinematography is not just decoration, it is storytelling. Where the camera is placed matters, what the scene chooses to show matters, how close we are to a character matters, what the frame hides matters. A good cinematic scene can make a normal conversation feel tense, emotional, funny, uncomfortable, or powerful before anyone even says anything. That is the advantage games have. They don't have to rely only on dialogue, they can make us feel the story throughout movement, framing, silence, lighting, expression, and timing. So when ZZZ uses this format, I want it to work, I really do. The problem is that right now a lot of these scenes don't feel cinematic. They feel like dialogue scenes where the camera is just looking for somewhere to stand. And sometimes it chooses very strange places. That is the part I kept running into. The characters are technically in a scene, the camera is technically moving between angles, but the framing does not always add anything to what is happening emotionally. Sometimes it even takes away from it, and the clearest example is probably the scene where the proxy confronts the source of their power. This should be one of the most important moments in their entire chapter, maybe even one of the most important moments for Belle and Wise so far. That is the moment where they face Pyrois. The moment where they confront the burden they have been carrying, the moment where their power starts becoming something more active, more personal, and much harder to ignore. On the writing side, this is huge. On the story side, this should feel like a turning point. But visually, it does not land as hard as it should. You have this serious conversation happening, but the camera keeps framing it in ways that feel awkward. One shot is focused so low that it almost feels like the scene is more interested in the character's shoes than the emotional weight of the moment. Another angle pulls back in a way that makes the whole thing feel oddly empty, and suddenly, instead of feeling completely locked into this major awakening scene, part of my brain is going, wait, why are we looking at it like this? Which is not really the reaction you want during what is supposed to be a major protagonist moment. That is what makes it frustrating. Not because ZZZ cannot do cinematic storytelling, it absolutely can. The same episode has moments that look great. When the game wants to go all in, it delivers scenes with real atmosphere, real emotion, and real visual impact. That is why these awkward scenes stand out so much. They don't feel like a lack of resources. This is Hoyo. Resources are probably not the first thing I would worry about. It feels more like this specific format has not fully found its language yet. The team is clearly trying to create something between a visual novel scene and a full cinematic cutscene, and I understand why. Full cutscenes are expensive, comic panels have their own limits, visual novel scenes can only do so much, so this middle ground format makes sense. The idea is good, the execution just is not there yet, at least not consistently. And that matters because presentation is not separate from story. A scene can be well written and still lose impact if the visual direction does not support it, especially in a moment like this. If the proxy awakening is supposed to feel powerful, the camera needs to help sell that power. If the conversation is supposed to feel intimate, the framing needs to bring us closer. If this is supposed to feel like Belle and Wise crossing a threshold, the scene should make us feel that shift. Instead, the writing is doing most of the heavy lifting while the visuals sometimes get in the way. And that is probably my biggest issue with this update, not the slow region introduction, not even the exposition. It is the fact that ZZZ is reaching for a more cinematic form of storytelling, and I'm not sure this specific style is strong enough yet to carry the moments it is being used for. Which is a shame, because underneath that presentation issue, the story itself is doing something I really like, and once I stopped thinking about the awkward framing, I started realizing something else. Even if the new region does not make the strongest first impression, the story around it started feeling more important than ever. One thing I kept thinking about while playing this chapter is that ZZZ is attempting something that sounds simple on paper, but is actually surprisingly difficult to pull off. The world keeps getting bigger, the mysteries keep getting bigger, the lore keeps getting bigger, and somehow Belle and Wise matter more than ever. Normally, those two things move in opposite directions. The moment the story starts introducing ancient civilization, legendary figures, world-changing events, secret organizations, and enough proper nouns to qualify as a university course, the protagonist usually starts shrinking. They're still there, they're still technically important, but the story slowly stops being about them. The mysteries become the main attraction, the lore becomes the main attraction, the world becomes the main attraction. The protagonist is just the person standing closest to the camera, and honestly, I was a little worried ZZZ might eventually drift in that direction too, because look at everything happening right now. We have the mystery surrounding Remiel, we have Lady Sunbringer, we have the new pieces of history being revealed, we have entirely new threats entering the story, we have questions that seem much larger than anything happening inside a single city. The scale of the narrative is growing rapidly, so logically Belle and Wise should feel smaller, except they don't. And that is where this chapter started clicking for me, because even though all these mysteries are expanding the world, none of them are replacing the protagonist. They're pulling the protagonist deeper into the center of it. Take Remiel. At first, she feels like a regional character, someone important for this particular chapter, but the more information we get, the stranger her role becomes. She doesn't really feel like an antagonist, at least not in the traditional sense, yet she's apparently willing to target Lady Sunbringer, and that immediately creates a question. Why? Because right now, neither side feels obviously evil, neither side feels obviously right. If anything, both sides feel like they're operating with information we're still missing. And that mystery becomes far more interesting than a simple hero versus villain conflict. What's actually happening between them? What history are we missing? And how does this connect to everything else the story is building toward? The story doesn't answer those questions. It gives us just enough information to realize there's a bigger puzzle hiding underneath, then it moves on. And Remiel isn't the only example. The chapter keeps doing this. Every time one mystery starts taking shape, another one appears behind it. The new enemies, the new abilities, the new threats, the feeling that the world is much stranger than we originally thought. But none of these mysteries pull attention away from Belle and Wise. They do the opposite. Because while all of this is happening, the story keeps building towards something we know is coming, the proxy awakening. Even during the slower sections, even during the exposition, even during the moments where the pacing drags a little, the question never really disappears. What is happening? When is it happening? What will it look like? What changes afterward? And I think that's a big reason the chapter still works, despite some of its weaker sections. There is always something ahead of us, some payoff we're waiting for, some moment the story is slowly building toward. So while the world expands horizontally, the protagonists are expanding vertically. The mysteries are getting larger, but Belle and Wise are becoming more important too. And that balance is what impressed me most. By the time we reach the ending sequence, the story has already convinced us that this isn't just another regional adventure anymore. Something bigger is happening, the world knows it, the villains knows it, the mysterious factions know it, and for the first time it feels like Belle and Wise know it too. Which brings us to the final sequence. If Act 2 is about the protagonist becoming the center of the story, Act 3 is about the moment the story finally decides to do something with that. The thing that surprised me most about this chapter isn't actually that Belle and Wise became playable. I know that's the headline, that's the thing everyone immediately talks about, but honestly, that's not the part I find interesting. If this was just the protagonist getting a new combat form, I don't think I'd be making an entire act about it. Gacha games do that all the time. New powers, new awakenings, new transformations. That's normal. What isn't normal is how ZZZ got here. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized this isn't really a story about Belle and Wise becoming stronger. It's a story about the system itself evolving. And that's something I wish more gacha stories would do. One thing that has always fascinated me about fantasy worlds is that the magic system itself isn't just a tool. It's part of the world's mythology, it's part of its identity, it's the thing that defines what is possible and impossible, what people believe, what people fear, what people spend their life trying to understand. That's why it always feels like such a waste when a story introduces an interesting system and then never really does anything with it. Characters get stronger, new abilities appear, bigger attacks happen, but nobody ever asks a very simple question. What happens when somebody starts pushing the system beyond the limits everyone assumed it had? And that's why this chapter excited me so much. Because that's exactly what Belle and Wise are doing. If you look back at their entire journey, they've never really been traditional protagonists. They weren't fighters, they weren't warriors, they weren't solving problems by punching harder than everyone else. They were proxies. Their entire role was understanding things, navigating things, experimenting, learning, trying to figure out how a system works. And little by little, that curiosity kept leading them somewhere new. A new discovery, a new possibility, a new way of interacting with the world that nobody had considered before. So when the Pyrois avatar finally appears, it doesn't feel like a random power-up. It feels like the logical conclusion of everything they've been doing since the beginning. And honestly, the avatar itself is fascinating, because it isn't just another combat form, it isn't just another weapon, it's not even entirely clear what it actually is yet. It's connected to them, but it also feels separate from them. They're controlling it, yet it still possesses an identity of its own, a will of its own. And immediately that creates a much more interesting relationship than most power systems ever bothered exploring. Because now there are multiple layers to the conflict. There's the protagonist versus the enemy, that's the obvious one. But there's also the protagonist versus their own power, the protagonist trying to understand something they're connected to but don't fully control, and maybe even more interesting than that, there's the protagonist versus the limits of the system itself. Every step Belle and Wise take seems to reveal that the rules everyone accepted might not be as absolute as people thought. That's where I think ZZZ is doing something genuinely special. The story isn't treating its power system like a finished product. It's treating it like a frontier, something people still don't fully understand, something that can still evolve, something that can still surprise us. And for me, that's infinitely more exciting than any new transformation could ever be. Because now the question isn't, what new ability will they unlock next? The question is, what is actually possible in this world? And those are two very different kind of stories. One is about progression, the other is about discovery. And personally, I'll take discovery every single time. Because for the first time, it feels like Belle and Wise aren't simply uncovering the mysteries of the world anymore. They're becoming one of those mysteries themselves. And honestly, that might be my favorite thing ZZZ has done since launch. So after finishing this chapter, I ended up with a pretty strange conclusion. If you ask me what I thought during the first hour, I probably would have talked about the weak cinematography, the awkward scenes, the introduction that didn't quite land the way I hoped it would, and those criticisms are still there. I still think some of the presentation choices held the chapter back, but the longer I sat with the story afterward, the less those things felt like the main takeaway. Because what stayed with me wasn't the introduction, it wasn't the floating city, it wasn't even the chapter's biggest mysteries. What stayed with me was the feeling that ZZZ has entered a completely new phase of its story. The protagonists are no longer just uncovering the world's secrets, they're becoming part of those secrets. The world is getting bigger, the mythology is getting bigger, the stakes are getting bigger, yet somehow the story still feels more personal than ever. And honestly, that's why I'm still so excited about where the story is going. Because even when this chapter stumbled, it still managed to leave me wanting to see what happens next. And at the end of the day, that's probably the most important thing a story can do. But that's just what I think. What do you think about this chapter? Did the new cinematic scenes work for you, or did they feel as awkward as they did for me? And what do you think about Belle and Wise's new direction? Is this one of the most interesting developments we had for the protagonist so far, or am I just way too excited about fantasy magic systems again? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more stories discussions like this one. Anyway, that's gonna be all from me for this one. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.